So I have some questions, particularly about the distinction between the dissident right and the radical right that you mentioned. So
yes,
you are saying essentially that there are four categories in the right, as you and Dr. Tamir Baron are writing in
yes,
your book, Fighting the Last War. So we have
correct.
establishment conservatives, then we have dissident right, radical right, and then revolutionary right. So
Right.
when it comes to the dissident right, would you said that they are highly critical of the establishment right, which would
Yes.
suggest that they do call for a change.
They do, but
So-
their problem with the establishment right is that it if you think about the conservative right, I mean, supposedly the definition of conservative implies something about conserving something.
Yes.
The idea is that you want to conserve. Well, let me just explain what I think conservatism is, and maybe that'll help clarify what we're talking about. I mean, I would actually say that conservatism is more of like a kind of disposition, almost like a psychological disposition, than an actual doctrine per se. I mean, basically, a conservative is not somebody who's opposed to all change, but somebody who believes that whatever change, social and political changes occur should be gradual rather than sudden. And that's one thing. The second idea that one could associate with conservatism is that they believe that the positive elements of the past should be preserved in this process of change. In other words, not throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Let's not reject everything. Let's not overturn everything. We want, as society is changing, we want to preserve the positive elements in this process of gradual change. So you could call, for example, the Soviet Politburo under Brezhnev conservative, because they weren't promoting revolutionary change. They were part of the nomenclatura. They were part of the system that was in a privileged position, and they wanted to preserve their position within this system, and so forth and so on. So, so that's what I mean when I talk about conservatism in general. The conservative right is what we've already talked about. Now, one of the main things that the dissident right believes, all the different currents of the dissident right believes, is that the establishment conservative right has failed to conserve anything of value, that it keeps it is incapable of resisting the push by the left to transform things, to make progress, to move toward progress, and therefore they feel that the conservative right has been corrupted and co-opted by its privileged position within the establishment, to the point that it no longer is willing to really take a stand and oppose what they consider to be dangerous trends pushed by the left. So the dissident right, all the different guys, you're talking about race realists, you're talking about immigration patriots, you're talking about, like I said, radical libertarians, paleoconservatives, neo-reactionaries. There's a whole group of dissident right ideologies that one can enumerate, but the main thing that they all share, they don't agree with each other. All those different components of the dissident right disagree with each other profoundly. But the one thing that they agree with is that the conservative right is part of the establishment, has been corrupted and co-opted, and is not conserving anything of value anymore.
Okay, so when it comes to the radical right that you think is distinct from the far right, which you identify.
I'm not. I don't use the term far right at all. In fact, I would say that what I call the radical right is the same thing as you could use the far right and the extreme right as a synonym for the radical right.
Okay.
I don't think there's the people who tried to distinguish between the far right and the radical right and the extreme right, to me, those distinctions don't seem to be spurious. So from my point of view, I prefer the term radical right, but I think it basically means the same thing as the far right and the extreme right.
Okay, so I think in your book you draw a distinction between extremism of ends and extremism of means. Would you say
Correct.
that this distinction is pertinent to the distinction between the radical right on the one hand and the revolutionary right? In that the radical is a bit more theoretical, whereas the others try to put it to action.
No, I wouldn't say that. I would say that in both cases we're talking about an extremism of goals. And in both cases, we could be talking about an extremism of means, in the sense that both might very well cross the threshold of violence and carry out violent actions against the system or against their enemies, their perceived enemies in society. So I think that both the radical right and the revolutionary right would certainly have extremist goals and also be willing to use extremist means. So the real difference is that the radical right is trying to restore something that they think existed in the past that has been lost. So they want to restore national greatness, for example. They want to restore like some kind of religiocentric society, or they want to bring the kings back. They want to bring the royalty back, or something like that, right? So,
okay, I have two questions here. So when you talk about people wanting to restore national greatness, it seems to me that this is something that virtually everyone says so. So that would have to require a particular conception of what it means for the nation to come back.
Of course,
because a lot of people would. Excuse me.
Yes.
But so just wanting to make the nation, let's say, improve, doesn't seem to me to be particularly radical in itself. Some forms of it, yeah.
I would agree with you.
Okay, yeah.
I would agree with you that it doesn't necessarily have to refer to some kind of authoritarian or illiberal nationalism. But when we're talking about the radical right, it does.
Yes.
And I think that's the point. When we're talking about the radical right, the kind of nationalism they envision is an illiberal nationalism, and it's an authoritarian kind of nationalism. Whereas other people might be talking about restoring national greatness, but not necessarily having those illiberal and authoritarian dimensions to it, something along that line, I would say.
Right. So let's go to the other term of abuse, fascism. Okay. To my mind, when we're talking about terms, there's a distinction between the conventional meaning that a term has and the technical or personal meaning that something means when they use a word. So, for instance, a lot of texts start with authors defining their terms. I'm reminded, for instance, of Thomas Reid, who in the essay of the Active Powers of Man starts by saying, by the liberty of the will, I understand the power that man has over the determinations of his will. So in that sense, he's introducing a term and he says precisely how he conceives of it. We could say that this is the personal meaning. And then we also have the conventional meaning, which is the meaning most people associate with a word. And that refers to the common aspect of language, because as social creatures, and we need to use language that is a public institution, if Wittgenstein is correct, that has a sort of, let's say, social aspect into it. And there's the meaning most people associate with a term. Now, to my mind, the term far right has connotations to fascism. But a lot of people write, excuse me, yep.
I think that's deliberate. In other words, I think that a lot of people who use the term far right as an abuse are trying to associate it with fascism, actually.
Okay.
They're trying to suggest that anybody that they label far right is akin to fascism or a proto-fascist. And that's part of the whole attempt to delegitimize and demonize all elements of the right that the left and the establishment don't like.
But that comes when people don't define what they mean by the far right, because they could just use it as a smear. Because,
that's exactly
for instance,
right.
You gave your classification, and whether people agree with it or not, they can say that, for instance, they can use that classification and judge future statements you may make about whether particular people or movements belong to the radical right or not. But a lot of people, politicians, journalists, activists, they are making statements on a daily basis about the far right, and they do not define it. So I think that, would you say that they do it in order to create maximalist smearing?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's precisely the point of it. If the vaguer the use of the term, the vaguer, the more expansive the application of the term can be. And I think, therefore, I mean, essentially, when the term far right essentially refers to any belief system or any movement that the current regnant establishment, which I would call the progressive globalist establishment, and people on the left don't like.
Okay. Question now. How big of a threat is it? If we believe mainstream media, it is the major threat in the Western world. And yes, we could say that very frequently they react to a lot of killings of people by scaremongering about the far right. So for instance, last Friday, we had stabbings in Solingen in Germany at a diversity festival from someone who seems to be an Islamist. Right, and the establishment response to that event was to just scaremonger about the far right.
That's correct.
It seems that at every chance they get, the establishment, as people who represent the establishment in the Western world, they're trying to constantly pay their taxes, let's say, intellectually speaking. They constantly think they have to talk about the dangers of the far right. So they create, if people take their words at face value, they would think that the far right, or the radical right, let's say, is the greatest threat right now in the Western world. What do you make of this, and how do we assess threats?
All right, well, there's a whole bunch of things that we need to unpack here. First of all, let's talk about the biased coverage of the events, like, for example, the attack in Solingen. There's two issues that are involved here. And after every jihadist terrorist attack, the main concern of the media seems to be, oh my God, what about the far right response to this attack? They're more concerned about the far right response to a jihadist attack than they are about the jihadist attack itself and the threat of Islamism. And let me just point out, and this is something that we make very clear in our book, Islamism is the most dangerous revolutionary right movement in the world. Let me say that again. Islamism is the most dangerous revolutionary right ideology and movement in the world. And it's committed tens of thousands, over probably 200,000 people have been killed just since the 1990s by jihadists in various parts of the world, mostly in the Muslim world, right? 44,000 terrorist attacks or something. People are calculating. I don't know if they're using the correct definition of terrorism, but the point is that the Islamists have carried out an enormous number of mass casualty attacks all over the world and have killed tens and tens of thousands of people. You would think that any sane person would be thinking, well, if I'm concerned about the right, my main concern is going to be about Islamism. But no. After every jihadist or terrorist attack in Europe or in the US, what is the media talking about? Oh, the Islamophobic backlash, or something like the imagined Islamophobic backlash. So the first point is that they're not even identifying Islamism as a revolutionary rightist ideology, which is just mind-boggling to me. So in other words, but it actually makes sense from their point of view, because they're always trying to portray Muslims as victims. Muslims are always innocent victims, and jihadists who carry out violence have nothing to do with Islam, blah, blah, blah. All this is nonsense, and we can get to Islamism a little bit later. But the point I'm trying to make is that this kind of coverage is completely dishonest, because number one, it's not focusing on the perpetrators of the attack, who are Islamists, who are radical revolutionary rightists of the most dangerous kind, who are living amongst us in Western societies and are being incited by Islamist groups and jihadist groups all over the world to carry out attacks on infidels. Right? That's an omnipresent and ever-present danger in every Western country. That's where the security focus should be, not on the Islamophobia backlash and the supposed threat from the domestic right. I mean, that's basically a canard. I don't mean that the domestic radical right and the revolutionary right don't constitute a threat, but that threat is consistently exaggerated, whereas the threat posed by Islamism and jihadist terrorism is consistently minimized or ignored. That's the reality.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.